Now, in the remaining 7 minutes, Fred, 7 points.
You've done a reply from NATO to the European Union, by any chance?
That's right. Well, in the answer session, yeah. Well, point one is that the EU tension, in my mind, was inevitable. The EU's common foreign and security policy was born out of the end of the Cold War and formed the best expression of Europe's autonomous moment, when the easing of the strategic interplay made it possible for Europe to speak its mind. One of the French ministers only last week put it in the following way: a child wants to walk. You have to give him the opportunity to stand up. And this is how the EU-NATO relationship after the Cold War, I think, shaped up. The main players were interested in the turf wars at the beginning. Not only the neo-hawks, the neocon hawks, but also people like Richard Holbrooke in Washington did not put much faith in the European Union. Holbrooke blamed the State Department for not preventing Rumsfeld from prematurely turning the NATO command in Bosnia over to a weak EU force. He called it a terrible mistake. And some EU critics have been convinced that European allies do not share the US threat perceptions on the role of Islamic fundamentalism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And in Europe, the suspicion was obviously strong that the United States was using NATO to have a European backing for its own projects, like in its own security interests. So we needed George W. Bush on the one hand and Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schröder on the other to make us realize the community of interest between the two organizations. Point two, the openness of the US to dialogue with the European allies at the moment, and the readiness of the Europeans to deliver at least a declared readiness, they have to be made real for the romance to last. The Europeans always claimed that their role in the alliance is not equal. Partly this is a natural phenomenon. The EU cannot entirely follow the planning method and the strategic concept of a world power. But what needs to be remembered now is that NATO is the only transatlantic organization with horizontal processes, horizontal integration of processes and mechanisms. The EU-US cooperation cannot compensate for that because it is a dialogue of partners. Hans-Gert Pöttering said a few days ago to Hillary Clinton in Brussels, what you said mostly could have been said by a European. There's no better compliment coming from a president of the European Parliament than that. Point three is credibility. Lacking ability to protect will hinder the ability to project, and NATO needs to re-establish its credible strategic defense presence, and the EU needs to organize better homeland security across the member states. And credibility needs to be maintained both in the traditional areas and in areas where there are new threats to European security. Point three is about Russia. The Russia effort at the moment, or the Russia gamble, as some would prefer to put it, will have an enormously powerful impact on NATO-EU relations. NATO will have to both function as an insurance of last resort and an avenue for dialogue with Russia. If it works, NATO and Russia will be ever closer, whatever it might mean at the end of the day. If it doesn't work, NATO will once more become the key irritant for the West's relations with Russia. It will critically influence the strategic pause which we now have with respect to enlargement. If Russia and NATO get along well, there will be no further enlargement unless Russia herself is in some way part of the framework. And the transformational aspects of enlargement will have to be done by somebody else by other fashion. Clearly the reset button still needs to be connected to some real wires, as David Smith put it. Point four is about the fact that NATO and the EU need to define well their priorities. Jamie used to refer to the Star Trek series when speaking about the new galaxies being discovered by NATO as we go along. Well, I think the truth is that today we know less than ever what threats will pose a real challenge to our security, whether it will be cyber attacks or whether it will be genetic engineering based on the deconstruction of the DNA codes and that getting into the hands of terrorists. We need a joint discussion about that, and we need the ranking of priorities. Point 5 is about the practicalities and the mindset. Sarkozy and Merkel wrote at the beginning of February about the necessary complementarity of the two organizations. Well, mindset remains the biggest barrier for putting NATO and the EU to a better use. The NATO-EU debate has been mostly about form rather than substance, and a different phase needs to start with a better understanding of the strategic environment. Point 6 is about the money that both sides put into the operation and the money they take out from it. It is both about the gap between the rhetoric and the resources, which has an impact on NATO's and EU's ability to take on more challenging operations. But also it is about the defense industry consolidation. The French defense minister spoke last week of the risk that EU members will be constrained by the US defense industry if they don't pool their defense industry capabilities better. Point 7 is what we could, for the purposes of our discussion, describe as petty disagreements that need to give grounds to a strategic cooperation. And the EU-NATO partnership needs to be institutionalized before the mood changes in either Washington or in the European capitals. A few very quick recommendations. I think the NATO strategic concept and the European security strategy need to be brought closer together. Well, the EU last year gave up on a major strategic review in the fear of reopening up old rifts and decided to focus instead on practical improvements on the ground. But there should be a new and joint process of strategic reassessment. The EU and NATO need to start working together on force planning. They need to build a strategic comprehensive approach based on the lessons learned from the civil and military experience. The equipment programs need to be harmonized better, and what is, I think, very important is that the EU and NATO should work together at the earliest possible stage of each conflict, and certainly before operations are launched. And this would be primarily about sharing of the situation, sharing by the situation centers of their accounts of the threat scenarios, and helping each other on the ground. So to conclude, Fred, NATO and the EU need to talk to each other, not about what they cannot do for one another, but what they can do to help each other in the process. They both can become relevant security actors in the future if they address the deficiencies and challenges we have described. And clearly the financial crisis will on the one hand exacerbate the security challenges. It will create insecurity of enormous dimension in some areas, but will also force, in my view, more synergy between Western partners across the spectrum of conflicts. And this is the good news. Thank you, Fred.